When the ASUS ROG Ally first hit the market, it was the first Windows-based PC handheld to have the Z1 Extreme chipset, and it made waves. It was essentially the first direct competitor to the Steam Deck. Now, this handheld could run all of the games that could run on the Steam Deck and more. You could get other launchers and other games running on there because it's a Windows-based handheld. And ever since then, there have been a multitude of PC handhelds that have come out, including ASUS's reiteration of the ROG Ally, the ROG Ally X. Now, the Ally X on paper is honestly just better than the ROG Ally, but when you take into account the different price points that they are at and the little spec bump that is there between the Ally to the Ally X, is it really worth it? Now, this video is really meant to show you the ins and outs of both of these handhelds and help you decide for yourself whether or not this is something that you would want to get over the other one. Personally, I have both in front of me, and I would go with the Ally X without a doubt because that spec bump that is there, whether it's ergonomically, in terms of power, in terms of battery, all of that just culminates to a better overall experience, despite some of the similarities between the two handhelds. One of the biggest things to take into account when you're considering either of these options is price. Now, obviously, one can be found for anywhere between $350 to $500 because one has the Z1 regular chipset, whereas the other one is the Extreme chipset, and one is $350 versus $500, and these can be found relatively anywhere. At the time of this recording, you can find them pretty much at Amazon, Target, Best Buy, any of the big box retailers that are out there, including ASUS themselves. But if you wanted to find an ASUS ROG Ally X, it's still at the MSRP of $799. Now, what's inside the box is pretty much the same either way, whether you go with the ROG Ally regular Z1 or the Z1 Extreme or the ROG Ally X. You're essentially going to get some documentation, you're going to get a charger, you're going to get a flimsy stand that's made out of paper, and then on top of that, you're going to get the handheld itself. That means that unlike the Steam Deck or even the Legion Go from Lenovo, you are not going to get a case. This is where today's sponsor, TomTalk, comes into play with their G47 bag. This is the G47 bag from TomTalk, and it is by far my favorite way of traveling with my PC handhelds. I've taken the same bag with me to Taipei, Taiwan for Computex earlier this year, and I've taken it with me for work trips all across the US, but I'm also planning on taking this with me to CES in January, because it does a good job. It has plenty of space. It fits not only the Steam Deck and the Steam Deck OLED, but it also fits the MSI Claw, the ROG Ally and Ally X, even the Legion Go from Lenovo, and this Nintendo Switch 2 that's going to be coming out, that's definitely going to fit in this as well. On top of that, there's plenty of space for extra accessories. So if you want to take things like a power adapter, a controller, a mouse and foldable keyboard, or a power bank, all of that just fits in here comfortably. You don't have to worry about anything. And there's even going to be space for your dock. That way you can play connected to your hotel room or whatever TV you're going to be gaming on. If you're interested in getting one for yourself, follow the link in the description below. There's actually a sale going on right now for their Black Friday campaign. It's 20% off the bag right now. So follow the link down below and grab yourself one for today. And thanks to TomTalk for sponsoring this video. All right, now that some bills are paid, we can go ahead and talk about the things that are similar between the ROG Ally Z1 Extreme and the ROG Ally X. See, with the Ally, you had the option of going with the Z1 non-extreme version or like the regular version, and the performance to price difference between the Z1 and the Z1 Extreme chip versions of these two Allies, it didn't make sense. You were better off going with the higher end model, especially if you're talking about $100-$150 more just to get that. The performance is almost double in some instances. Now, there is a use case for the regular non-extreme Z1 version of the Ally, and that's if you're more into 2D titles that don't require a lot of processing power. If you're playing more AAA titles, then yes, I would recommend the Z1 Extreme version. But if you're, let's say emulating titles, or if you just want to play more of those indie titles or side scrollers, then you'd be fine with the Z1. Now, that's really the only way that I would recommend that. Personally, I would go with the Z1 Extreme version because you're just going to get the best of the best when it comes to playing on these handhelds. But aside from that, I digress when it comes to the CPU and the differences between all of them. When we're looking at the screens, they're exactly the same across the board. We're talking about a 7-inch 1080p screen going all the way up to 120 hertz, and it does have VRR. The color representation that's on here is honestly awesome. I personally love it. I didn't have to worry about color calibrating anything or pulling out my Spider Express to get things, calibrated and looking nice. It just was that way out of the box, and I have no complaints because of that. And aside from that, in terms of what is comparable, pretty much that, and maybe the connectivity that's there. You're still going to have that Wi-Fi 6E as well as the Bluetooth 5.2, but aside from that, you pretty much have a ton of differences between the two of them. There are two main differences between the ROG Ally Z1E and the ROG Ally X. Now, with the Ally X, you are going to be getting double the battery life. And I will say that with extensive use of the ROG Ally X, well, it doesn't feel like double. Sometimes it feels almost like triple the amount of battery life. I don't know if this has to do with the additional RAM that's there and just everything in terms of thermals and keeping things throttled down. It just works better, and the experience that I've had isn't 2 times, it's 2.5 or 3 times more battery life than the original Z1 version of the Ally. Another thing that is worth mentioning is that because of that additional RAM that's there, you can allocate more RAM to the VRAM of the GPU, which means that you can get better performance. This is all done in Armoury Crate, which the Armoury Crate 1.5 version that they have is just, it just runs so much better than the original Armoury Crate. Now, while I was in Taipei, Taiwan, and I was trying things out, it definitely had some bugs, but at the official public release of the Armoury Crate updated version for the Ally X as well as the Ally, things ran much better. There were still a few bugs here and there, but at this time, as of this recording, it runs relatively smooth and I don't have much to worry about. Now, with all of that being said and done, there are other things to take into account. The Ally X is a tad heavier. Now, this is actually kind of an engineering marvel simply because of the fact that batteries are heavy, and doubling the battery size means that you're going to have to double the battery weight. And there really isn't much that you can do about battery weight, but instead what they did was reduce the weight of the components that are inside. That means PCB, analog sticks, I mean, all sorts of other things that are there to improve the overall experience. And yeah, it is heavier, but you're talking about 70 grams. It's not that big of a deal when you take into account that you're getting double the battery life, and the unit itself is slightly thicker than the actual original Ally. This is because the Ally X needs to have better cooling. One of the things that I wanted to test out with this was actually one of the main complaints that my wife as well as other users of the original Ally had, which was that the screen got extremely hot. Now, the way that I did this is I ran Time Spy on the actual units, which is, for those of you who don't know, this is an artificial test. This is a way of pushing the graphics that are on there and just to get a better overall feel of how this handheld performs when you're doing crazy graphics and things like that on screen. As it was running, I went ahead and tested what the actual temperature on the screen was. Now, to my surprise, the difference that I saw was only 3 degrees Celsius. Now, this isn't that big of a difference, but when you're talking about, you know, something being extremely hot and not so hot, I was expecting more of like that 5 to 6 degree difference that I believe they quoted. I could be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments down below. But as far as I could tell, I only saw 3 degrees difference when running Time Spy. Ergonomics are very subjective. They are very, very personal. So if there's something that you do like, it's very much up to you and your unique experience. For example, for me, the Legion Go for me is totally uncomfortable. After maybe 30 minutes of gaming on it, like it's heavy. The edges that are there dig into my palms. It's just not comfortable to hold and play on the Legion Go for a long period of time. The ROG Ally and Ally X are different ergonomically because of the build that is there and also the weight differences that are there. But when we're talking about button placements, they're almost exactly identical. There are a few differences that are there, but aside from that, the actual buttons and analog sticks and triggers, all of that feels different. For example, the D-pad, although the membrane is the same on both the Ally X and the Ally, the actual shell that's on top is very different on the original Ally, and it just feels like a cheap attempt to kind of make an Xbox Series D-pad. But with this, it's just, I don't know, I prefer the one on the Ally X. It feels much more kind of like a Saturn D-pad, and I'm all for it. The analog sticks that are here, they're very easy to push around, and when I use the left analog stick, I don't know if this has been improved with recent iterations and refinements on the original Ally's manufacturing, but when it comes to this day one unit that's right over here, It's just very uncomfortable, and you can feel grinding when you're pointing up on the analog stick, on the left analog stick that's here. The face buttons are very loud, especially in contrast to the Ally X. I thought that it wouldn't be that big of a difference, but it's definitely there. And my left shoulder button gets stuck from time to time whenever I'm using it. Also, the triggers, they are much more ergonomic on the Ally X than they are on the Ally. It just kind of like slips off. There really isn't that much of a curve on the actual triggers. And the macro keys that are on the back, they're very easy to push, almost so much so that I turned them off whenever I was gaming on my original Ally. But aside from that, there really isn't too much more to bring up. Now, I will say that I've never been a fan of the volume rocker being all the way at the top. I would rather it be closer to where my hands are going to be at, but I understand why it's placed there. The Ally X, on the other hand, definitely has a lot of improvements that are there, but it's definitely not all sunshine and rainbows. When it comes down to it, there are a couple of things that I want to go ahead and mention. For example, with the ROG Ally X, whenever I'm using the right analog stick there, I run a chance of accidentally touching the screen if ever I go left because of how close it is. It's much closer than it was on the original Ally. Although the face buttons are quieter, they're also much more solid, if that makes sense. They're not as loose on the Ally X in contrast to the Ally. Also, I want to mention that the triggers, even though they're much more ergonomic, they feel like they have much more travel distance. Not enough to actually, affect gameplay per se, but it's definitely there, and it's definitely noticeable when you're holding the two of them. If you have one or the other, you're not gonna notice a difference, but it's definitely something that bears mentioning. Also, the analog sticks are tighter. That means that you just need to put in a little tiny bit more force in order for them to actually have input. The dimples that are on the analog sticks seem much more deeper, and they just feel like they are better designed to be used correctly. The macro buttons have been moved closer to the center, which means that you aren't going to accidentally push them unless you want to. Because of that, I haven't actually turned these off, and I actually do use them frequently. Now, I haven't had any issues with my shoulder buttons, but they seem to just work fine for the most part. I'm not really complaining about things when it comes to the buttons themselves. Now, one of the things that I do want to talk about is the micro SD card that is seen on here. I haven't ran into any issues so far with the ROG Ally X. With the Ally, I did have my micro SD card finally, or the micro SD card reader finally die, but when it comes to the actual Ally X, it seems to be working just fine, so I have no complaints when it comes to that. I also want to mention that one of the biggest issues that I had with the original Ally was the fact that there was this XG mobile port that was on top. Now, I understand why it was designed that way. I understand why it's there. It's proprietary though, which is one of the things that I did not like about it. Because of the fact that it was proprietary, it just kind of turned me off entirely from actually buying that for myself and seeing how it worked on the original Ally. When it comes to the Ally X, on the other hand, it uses USB 4. You have two ports up here. So you have two USB 4.0 ports at the top, and it does support eGPU through that USB 4 port. I'm much more of a fan of open source, of being able to use any piece of hardware that I want on any other piece of hardware because I'm paying for it. I'm buying it anyways, so I want to be able to use it. And this is one of the things that I like about the ROG Ally X is because there's two USB ports there. So if I wanted to have it charging so that I can use that 30-watt power mode and not have to worry about battery life, and also use my Future XR Pro glasses, then I can. And I don't have to worry about using some crazy dongles because there's enough USB ports here. This is something that I feel like every PC handheld should do moving forward. Have two USB ports. Just makes life so much easier. But I digress. When it comes down to it ergonomically though, it does feel much more comfortable. There is much more of an ergonomic grip in contrast to the ROG Ally, but I think that the reason why that's there on the Ally X is because of the thickness that it's a thick boy, guys. In comparison to the original Ally, it's thick, but it makes sense because of the battery that's there. Speaking of battery life, it's pretty much really dependent. Your experience that you get with battery life is very dependent on the different operating mode that you're using on your respective handheld. Now, the original ROG Ally had three different modes. You had 10 watt, which was their silent mode, then 15 watt, which was their performance mode, and then 25 watt was the maximum that you could go unless you went into manual mode and, you know, added more juice into your processor. But I digress. At the end of the day, it really just depended on the different modes that you were using, and that would affect not only the performance of whatever game you were playing, but also how quick your battery depleted. Now, when it comes to the ROG Ally X, because it has a larger battery, they upped the amount of wattage that goes depending on the different operating modes that you have. Now, instead of 10 watts, it's 13 watts for the silent mode, 17 watts for performance, and then 25 watts at the top, with 30 watts being the maximum when plugged in for both consoles respectively. At the end of the day, it really just depends on the experience that you want. For example, when I was flying back from Europe to the United States over the summer, I had my ROG Ally X on the plane, and I was playing a little bit of Elden Ring when I noticed after about an hour and a half-ish that my battery started showing 50%. That's when I said, okay, let me just turn off Elden Ring and lower down the wattage to a custom 7 watts and play games like Dave the Diver or Dead Cells that don't really need that much processing power in order to play the games that are there. This is honestly the beauty of the flexibility of this operating system as well as this handheld, because I was able to not just play it an hour, 2 hours, or 3 hours. I played almost 7.5 hours of just non-stop gameplay while I was flying on the ROG Ally X without being plugged in. And this is a beautiful thing about this. Now, can you hit those same numbers on the Ally? Not really, because of the battery capacity that's there, but you can get pretty close to about that 50% mark if you were to put in custom settings and kind of get things going. You're not going to be able to play an hour and a half on battery of Elden Ring on here, but you can get pretty much 50% of what you would get with the Ally X. Now, obviously, this is once again dependent on what operating mode that you're using, and well, the more juice that you drink, the faster that your battery is going to run out. Regardless of what wattage it is that you're going to be using in the operating mode, you still have to deal with fan noise. Now, I thought that the fan noise was going to be a huge difference between these two, but unfortunately, it really wasn't that much. I was seeing around a 3 decibel difference between the ROG Ally and the Ally X, with the Ally X being quieter. But have a listen. There you have it. And honestly, I didn't really notice the huge difference when I was comparing these two side by side, but throughout my time while using the ROG Ally X, I don't know if this is a placebo effect or anything like that, but when I was using it, it felt like it was cooler. It felt like it was running quieter as well. So for me, it's odd that I got the ratings or the readings that I got when I was comparing these two side by side in that fashion. One of the things that I don't see talked about often enough is audio quality. Now, I did a poll recently on the channel asking people, do you prefer using headphones or using the built-in speakers in your handhelds to play your games? And the majority of the people said they prefer the built-in speakers, which makes sense. I mean, if you're traveling or whatever it may be, it might just be one less thing to worry about. And if you're at home and you're not bothering anyone, yeah, you might as well just have the speakers that are built in. It just makes sense. Now, when it comes to audio quality on the market, as there's no ifs, ands, or buts, right now, at the time of this recording in November of 2024, the best speakers on the market on any handheld are in the MSI Claw. Despite the performance issues that the chipset has, the MSI Claw has an auditory experience that is unparalleled. It's almost like a second set of vibration motors whenever you're actually gaming on there. But I digress. When it comes to the Ally and the Ally X, the Ally X does have technically better speakers than the Ally, but the Ally is louder. Here, have a listen. It's weird because the Ally straight out of the box, it's just louder. And by the way, like I updated all the drivers for like the speakers and everything, and the Ally was just simply louder. But the Ally X has deeper chambers, which allows for much more clarity. Now, technically, you can go ahead and use third-party apps to EQ your speakers and get better audio out of it and louder audio out of it. But to be honest, I'm okay with a speaker not being as loud but clear. Now, don't get me wrong, the speakers on the Ally X are plenty loud. Like, you can definitely listen and hear whatever is happening on there, but clarity is much more important than having something that's ridiculously loud. Because at the end of the day, if you don't understand what your character is saying and things are kind of like crackly or muffled or whatever it may be, then it doesn't matter if it's loud or not, if that makes sense. I'll have a link down below to an app that I used to EQ the audio in my ROG Ally X, and that way, you know, you can see and get that ready for you if you have an Ally X yourself and you want better audio out of it. All right, let's talk numbers. Now, I want you to know straight from the get-go that I only tested 3 games: Horizon Zero Dawn, the remastered version, Cyberpunk 2077, and Shadow of the Tomb Raider. And because of my microSD card slot getting fried, I had limited space in terms of how many games I could put on there, so I put in those 3. Also, they have built-in benchmarks, which allowed me to just let them run while I was doing work for my actual day job. By the way, subscribe to help support the channel. That way I can actually make this a full-time thing for myself. But anyways, aside from that, 1080p, 120 hertz refresh rate, and very low settings on everything except for Cyberpunk 2077. That one I used the Steam Deck preset that was built in. But I also want to add one more thing. Because these were all at 30 watts and had the maximum allotted VRAM through Armory Crate, I saw some interesting results. Obviously, there's more RAM that's disposable with the Ally X, so technically you could get better performance. But when it came down to it, Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered just was weird on the Ally. I could boot into the game, and I verified the integrity of the files. I made sure that I had the latest graphics drivers and pretty much all of the drivers for the handheld, but it wouldn't run. I tried running benchmarks and I was like, okay, maybe there's a problem with the script for the benchmark to run. And I was like, whatever, I'll just boot up the game and use Riva Tuner to get all of the information that I need to get the data to provide. But that didn't work either. So I'm at a bit of a loss. By the way, if you have any, help, tips or anything like that, let me know down in the comments. But I couldn't get it to run on the ROG Ally. On the Ally X, it ran just fine. Now with the ROG Ally X, I got 26 frames per second using the benchmark. When it came to Shadow of the Tomb Raider, I got 67 frames per second on the ROG Ally X. On the ROG Ally though, it was 61. And when it came to Cyberpunk 2077, the Steam Deck preset got me 59.12 seconds on the ROG Ally X, and the Ally got me 40.46 frames per second. Now, when it comes to the performance and everything like that, this is really where that extra RAM comes into play, at least in my opinion, because you're able to allot more to the VRAM in order to get a better overall performance of the games as they run. Now, one of the things that many people have talked about is the fact that the Z1 processor is great in terms of CPU, but the GPU is lacking. And I feel like, and I'm pretty sure most people agree with me, that the next iteration of the Z1, whatever it's called, should have more GPU horsepower. This would allow for games to simply just run better overall than they can on the Z1 Extreme, and even the custom APU on the Steam Deck, or even the 8840U that you can find on some of the handhelds, 7840U, and so on and so forth. Honestly, at the end of the day, if we can put more GPU into the SoC, then you might be able to get a better experience when it comes to playing some of these heavier hitting titles like Baldur's Gate 3 or Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered or Cyberpunk 2077 than you would without it. And honestly, at the end of the day, I want to have a better experience when gaming on the go. So who would I recommend the Ally or the Ally X to? Well, there are 2 main scenarios that I would really look at. If you are somebody that doesn't really care about getting the most frames possible, but wants to play on a handheld, and you're pretty much going to be playing at home, either in bed or on the couch, and you're going to be plugged in, go with the Ally. I think honestly for most people it's fine, and if you're somebody that wants to play lightweight titles, you can even do the Z1 non-extreme version and get away with it, especially for the $350 that it costs right now. Like, it's insane that you can get that much power in your hands and just play and just be fine. Now, if you're somebody that does have to worry about battery, like if you have battery FOMO or anxiety and you kind of just don't want to have to worry about that, and you want that extra juice when you are playing plugged in, then I would recommend the Ally X. It's the best of the best. Now, don't get me wrong, there's the AMD Strix Point handhelds that are going to be coming out soon if they're not released already, and you're going to get a nice significant boost in performance. And obviously, Intel is going to be working on like their next round of chips. So there's a lot that's happening in the handheld space. But as of right now, if you're comparing the Ally to the Ally X, I personally would recommend the Ally X over the Ally, just because I like having that flexibility. I like being able to do a multitude of things on the handheld and not have to worry about the battery life and just be fine. So what do you guys think of the ROG Ally or the Ally X? Are you considering getting one for yourself? Do you already have one? Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on things. And if you want to hear my thoughts on the debacle that I had with the ROG Ally X when I first got it, then click this video over here. And if you want to hear my thoughts on the Ally after having it for an extended period of time, then click this video over here. And until next time, guys, I will see you on the next one. Peace.